Hello, this is Pastor Matthew Woods from Grace Lutheran Church in New Albany, Indiana, and this is the weekly devotion for February 6, 2023. Today's title, Following the Recipe. Well, I come to this today. As you watch today, we have had our chili cook-off yesterday. And in full disclosure, I'm actually filming this before the event, obviously. But along those lines today, the idea of the chili cook-off, I thought I would talk about recipes today. Now, as you probably heard, each year I make my vegetable or veggie chili for the cook-off. Now, I have never intended to win. It was never designed for that. In fact, the first time I made it, I found out that there was a vegan in our church who would come to this and not have anything to eat but bread. So I started making this for her, and just so some of our vegans would have something to eat. So she appreciated it, and I've been making it ever since. Now the recipe is simple. You got 1 green pepper, 1 yellow pepper, 1 red pepper, 1 orange pepper. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? But all those things get chopped up along with some onion, and I put those in a bowl. Then I pour it into a crock pot. Cans of kidney beans and corn and whole tomatoes and chickpeas and anything else that I might want in there as far as vegetables go. Then I mix up another bowl. It's ketchup, and it's got chili powder and honey and cayenne pepper and a little bit of garlic, and you mix that all together. And then when you're done with that, you put it all into the crock pot together, you stir it up, and you heat it up for the big event. So I'm a meat eater, right? But I like this particular chili. I got so many veggies in it that it's thick and it's hearty and it's good. And for those who want it, you can add a little cheese or a little something else on top of the bowl, and voila, it's good, right? It's for some reason even a prize winner once. So I asked the question today: what happens if I leave out the chili powder, for example, or if I neglect to put in the garlic or the onion? Chances are it will not taste the same, right? It will not be as intended, and therefore anyone who tried it would not be able to enjoy it as it was intended based on the recipe, what was written down. Yet by following it, I'm able to feed a lot of people, and it often goes fast because PK has unintentionally given it a lot of attention, advertising in his envy, and I wink at that one, that people go looking for it now. Okay, well, at least it's there, and somehow it's gotten to be fairly popular. Great. But God has recipes too. He's got good ones. Look at what he does with creation, for example. Some daylight, millions of stars, and seasoning the skies, if you will, with those stars, plants, animals, and of course humanity. Imagine if he'd had left something out. What kind of creation would it be? What kind of life would it be if God left out dogs or cats? Or what if he left off the moon? How would the tides even know what to do with themselves? The human being is also a brilliant recipe of skin and bone and brain cells and RNA and DNA helixes, and complicated and amazing. Some of us don't have to imagine if God left out something like kidneys. Some of us have lost those things. But what if we left off something as simple as an ability to smile or to hear or to see? Again, some of us don't need to imagine those things or to smell. Usually, when such things are absent, a person learns to adapt in amazing ways. Something else, by the way, a human being does very well. But the psalmist in Psalm 139 is correct. We are beautifully and wonderfully made. We are made by a recipe. Now, I would also argue that the law of God is a recipe as well. A recipe of righteousness, in fact. Remember what Jesus says yesterday in his gospel in Matthew chapter 5? Let's remind ourselves just real quick. It says in verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away or disappear, not the not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of the pen will disappear until everything has been fulfilled. Therefore, anyone who breaks these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches others these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's pretty tough, isn't it? Pretty hard words. But first, Jesus says the law is meant as a whole, without leaving out the smallest letter or the least stroke of the pen. Everything counts. Every little bit of seasoning sprinkled in. Everything does. As anyone would know with a recipe, it's often the little dashes and the little spices that make it all work. Now, keeping this in mind, loving the Lord with all of your heart and your mind and your soul and strength in the first commandment is just as important as not committing adultery, not murdering anyone, or bearing false witness. The law is meant as something like a recipe where all the ingredients matter if we want to get what is intended in the final product, namely righteousness. It is not really up to us to leave anything out or to change it. The righteousness of the Pharisees the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are least in the kingdom of heaven. Why is that? Well, because you can't leave out the 8th command or the 10th commandment. They're all important. By Jesus' estimation, such people will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Why is that? Well, because they're teaching others to break those commandments. Now, but notice the word that Jesus uses in keeping the law. The verse says, therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Poesis. It's a word for practices, and it's an interesting Greek word. Literally, it means to bring something to be that wasn't there before. That could be a lot of things. I might decide to start playing the guitar and develop a talent that wasn't there before. See, the law is not something we create, but something that is followed, something that is learned and incorporated into our lifestyle. Like like creating a chili, it is something that is learned and taught, right? The first time I made that chili, I followed the recipe. I had to read every single word and pay attention to every detail. And of course, that was all good, right? I'd rely on the recipe very heavily. But after years of making this veggie chili and practicing the recipe, I've got most of it down by heart at this point. It's like this with everything. You can golf, or learning to back up a trailer in a car, or learning to tie one's shoes, which soon enough, Caden, my grandson, will learn to do. The law of God is a learned thing. We don't perfect it, but we practice it. We practice the law so that it becomes more and more familiar, more and more incorporated, and becomes more and more natural to us. I've always said that you get good at what you practice. A talent that wasn't there before comes to us much in the same way we learn how to tell the truth, for example. We can get pretty good at telling the truth in love and with tact, for example, or we can get good at yelling and losing our tempers. One way or another, we get good at whatever it is we're practicing, whatever it is we're putting into practice. The Lord's recipe for the law is spelled out throughout the chapters of Matthew 5 through 7 and Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And it concludes with the famous parable of the wise and foolish builders in Matthew 7, 24 through 27, where Jesus emphasizes that the practicing of his teachings will have certain results or consequences. And so he says, verse 24, therefore anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house in the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house in the sand. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds beat against that house and it fell with a great crash. So putting into practice the teachings of Jesus draws us closer to Jesus, while not practicing his teachings leaves one far from Jesus, which Jesus calls foolish. Why? Because the house collapses, doesn't last. Now let's go to the most important recipe of all. And the most important recipe is the recipe of our salvation. From Genesis 3 on, we can trace a recipe that has been painstakingly developed and followed through Israel, taught by the prophets, and finally fulfilled in Jesus. He describes himself as one fulfilling the law and the prophets, right? Not destroying them. That's right. The virgin birth, his circumcision, his descendancy from Abraham, Judah, and David, overcoming temptation in the wilderness for 40 days, raising Lazarus, even his Sermon on the Mount, the betrayer, the denier, the nails, the scourge, breathing his last and giving up his spirit, and most importantly, rising from the tomb, all to include us in his recipe of salvation. It's a perfect recipe, and it leads to something everlasting. It blends together perfectly for an eternal feast of a wedding that will take place between the Lamb and his bride, the church. Now, from a believer's point of view, this is the true prize winning recipe that we depend on most. And so recipes matter, especially the ones that are given to us in Jesus. They're all laid out for us on those pages of Scripture. And so it is good that we follow them and that we put them into practice. May the Lord bless us this week. God bless you, and thanks for joining me today. I pray that it is a good week for you, and look forward to seeing you again. All righty. Take care. Lord be with you. Bye-bye.